The origins?
Yeah, origin.
Okay, thank you. The origin started pretty, about 2019, and it was during the COVID, no? Oh.
Origins of you, not origins of Walmart.
The origins of Walmart was started,
Clarify.
Well, I usually started like before that.
oh, before that? Yeah. Oh, I've been doing this, I've been doing electronic or experimental music since the early 80s. About 83, 84, I started to get the idea that I wanted to do something that wasn't necessarily what a lot of my friends were doing, which was punk and hardcore. And, you know, going back to 1979, I got to see a band called Suicide at Max's Kansas City, and I wanted to do that. And everybody else was doing punk and hardcore, and, you know, I stuck with that for a little while because that was fun. But then I wanted to get back to some sort of electronic music performance. And, you know, starting around 83, 84, I kind of got nudged out of, you know, not nudged, I just really didn't want to see any more punk bands. It was getting really violent at shows and everything, and I'd seen all the great bands in their prime. So I moved on and I started to just work with tapes and really cheap, you know, almost throwaway electronic gear. Some of it wasn't even musical, it was just machines or anything I could record. And then tape recorders were, you know, like the number one instrument. Instrument one was always a tape recorder. And from that point on, I just started to build this idea of what to do. But it always had to be interactive with the public on some level, because there's always like a tension between private and public space. We are in private property, but we are in public space with each other. So there's always a sort of give and take and tension that I always like to play off of when it comes to working live, at least, with music like this. It shouldn't just be dormant and it shouldn't just be passive. There's a lot of passive music. Like, I like ambient music too, but I really think that this music is not passive, it's active. And I try to keep that spirit going.
Great, thank you. That was a question of how, I guess, you started getting into the sounds that you were making at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Very beginning. We have another question. Yes.
When you started doing this more in the 80s, who at that time were your sonic influences, and who would you say are, you know, you talked about this sort of relational aesthetics aspect of crowd participation or dissolving the sort of like line between performer and audience and having it be one experience for everybody in the room.
Yeah.
Who were your influences in that? Were there performance artists? Was it activism? Was it sort of combative, protest art? And what were your sonic influences at the time? I know you mentioned Suicide and Suicide. Yeah, I feel like kind of the Beatles for a lot of us. Where it's like that's the Rosetta Stone. Like even like Glenn Bronca heard Suicide, and that changed his entire perception of what we've done. So,
That's right. Yeah.
But what were some of your sonic influences and some of your performance influences? Is my question.
The very first artist I ever met in my life was a guy named Vito Acanzi, who is a multimedia performance. He's a conceptual artist. He was pretty much born and raised in New York City, and he was part of this movement in the 60s of conceptual art. And he's done just about every medium there is. And I met him when I was a very young kid because I used to play around, and then I eventually started working at an institution called PS1 Museum in Queens, which is now part of MoMA. But it was an independent, literally a 3-story public school that had been converted, you know, for reuse by a woman named Alana Heiss, who worked with the city to get it up and running by 1971. So in 1976 or so, I went into the building because we used to just play around in the area. And at that point, it wasn't a pristine gallery like this. It was raw space. It was basically a schoolhouse. So the lockers were still there. There was a gymnasium. There were basketball hoops and everything. So it was just an out of commission schoolhouse. And he was the first artist I met walking down the hall. And I said, hi, and he said, hello. And I said, are you an artist? He says, yes. And I go, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I got a few things I'm thinking about. And he was just like, he would tell me these things. So he said, this is a true story. He said, hey kid, do you know hardware store? I go, yeah, actually. And the guy who ran the hardware store, his name was Jack. Jack lived on the same street that I lived on in Long Island City, in 46th Road. I go, Jack's right around the corner. So Vito went down there to buy shovels. And I figured, okay. And I didn't think about it at all afterwards. But like when there was a big opening at PS1, that Sunday or something, or was it a week or so, I can't remember, this is 76 or something. So I went with my mother to PS1, and there was all sorts of things going on, as you can possibly imagine. Performance art, theater, video and everything, but Vito was in the basement in the furnace room, because they still had furnaces, and he was shoveling coal into the giant furnaces, and that was his performance. And this is the same guy that I just met last week. And then later on, he had another piece that was up on the 3rd floor that was basically almost a ramp that led to it was a window. There was like a giant bay window. And he built a ramp. So basically, you could just jump leap out the window, or just drive a car or whatever, a bicycle out the window into the courtyard. And from that point on, I just started meeting a lot of other really fantastic conceptual artists. It was really conceptual art, Dan Graham, James Turrell. And then sonically, as I moved on, the first early ones were, of course, Suicide, and Lloyd Rice was another one, because I really liked his idea of pranksterism, the idea that you can interact with the public on such a level that you confuse them. And it was basically like holding up a mirror, the irony of the mirror, of holding the mirror back up at society or the public, and seeing what they're doing is what I'm reflecting back at you, And then I also like Monte Casazza a lot too, because he was another person that was very, very aware early on that this music had a place. I mean, he actually coined the term industrial music for industrial people. So I owe a debt of gratitude to all of them. Patrick Miller from Minimal Man was another person, just a one-person act, drum machine, guitar, distortion, dissonance, and a political message about like what's going on here, and a lot of people were feeling very, very ostracized, marginalized, and alienated by a lot of what we consider the group consensus of society. So punk and no wave and industrial were places to go so that people could meet, I feel, and feel safe and with other like-minded people, and still operating in a larger system of society and the public and the art. And also rejecting the restraints and framing of art. Like, not to put anything wrong, the Torrance Art Museum, I'm very grateful that they have us here, but there's institutionalized art where you go through a system. You go through a school, and then you have to go through this huge, almost corporate system, the way it's structured. And I like something that's completely outside the academy and outside the institution, that questions what they're doing in there. Because it's not always from these institutions where greatness begins. Greatness is sometimes on the outside, and then sometimes is adopted or even incorporated or even stolen sometimes from the institutions themselves. And that's a big question that I like to ask too. That's why I use the term Walmart, because I don't need to do any more publicity. This is one of the largest companies in the world, and I just like use them as an example on corporate power and how the framing is set by corporations. So I always need to have this sort of aggravation, to sort of get underneath the skin of the institutionalized ideas of social, social framing it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I have more questions here. We've got time here. We've got one over here. Yes, you.
So, listening to this performance and watching it, it seems like it's poking fun at banality and corporate soullessness of box stores like Walmart. And the
deliberate usage of harsh noise font to sonically emphasize that. It seems to be a deliberate choice. Am I correct in saying that part of the performance involves poking fun at such banality, or is there something else to it that particularly missing that has not explained by the previous question?
I'll give you a little bit more background on Walmart and maybe take it from there. One of the first things that this happened to be as early as 2010, there was a Black Friday stampede at Christmas time. They opened the doors of a Walmart somewhere in the U.S. and all these people ran in to buy that were, items that were on sale. It was a Christmas sale, and people got hurt. I think someone even died, and there was a lot of aggression and fighting over it. And there was no regulation, there was no security, there wasn't any sort of order. And I remember that, and like, I'm old enough to say that back in it was in 77, 78, there was a stampede at a Cincinnati Who show, and people got killed, okay? So this immediate rush of like the roaring crowd that want to have something, okay, and this desire and the need of things that corporations and, entertainment, they basically create a desire for something, and then like there's sometimes a mad rush for them. So that aggression and violence that I started to see in the scarcity or the artificial scarcity of something is something that I sort of, it was in the back of my mind for a long time. So then what happened was during COVID-19, around 2019, I started to see a lot of, on the internet and on social media and also on television, there was a lot of violence and aggravation going on. A lot of people were very uncertain about where the country was going and how dangerous COVID was and all this. And I don't want to get into the whole minutiae of the politics of this. But basically, people were starting to react very, very aggressively towards each other. And I started to see a lot of fighting, like basic fist fighting going on at Walmart, Target. I'm not singling out Walmart. It just basically there was a lot of aggression going on. And I didn't understand this except that these videos are somewhat amusing, but they're also very, very concerning. I can see that as entertaining, like, haha, there's people fighting, but then there's also a very concerning thing because, when my wife and I are out and about in the city, I don't want to have an aggressive situation, and these things could happen at any time. Now, since I've been doing this for a while, I also know that this type of music and this type of culture and art, it likes to play around with lurid ideas, a lot of violence, a lot of graphic imagery involving violence or death and sex, all this stuff. But I see these things actually in the everyday. I see it at Walmart in the structures of corporate power. So I don't need to make a collage of random things, though I really enjoy this artwork, but I saw it directly in what I was experiencing in the city and also what I would see on TV. So it wasn't like, TV loves to sort of exaggerate how bad things are, and then you go out and you say, well, it's really not that bad, but then there are situations that come up, like aggressive driving, road rage. I mean, we are constantly having to check ourselves when we're driving on any of the freeways in Los Angeles on just how aggressive drivers are. And where is all this aggression coming from? Well, there's a lot of different things. I have my own sort of ideas on where this is coming from, but there seems to be an anxiety going on. And it seems to be not just people's own personal anxieties and behaviors within themselves, but I really think that the environments that we live in are creating some sort of tension. And we see it all the time. Even if you get out of Los Angeles and you start driving down the freeway, you will see the same corporations, the same fast food, the same corporations over and over again at the side of the highways. And almost like there's a never-ending, almost like a tourist example of how corporate power and all of these giant companies are basically changing up the landscape as if there's nothing else. And this culture here, it doesn't even it's not even a blip on the radar. We have been underneath this. It has never been exploited by pop media culture so far, okay? And the day that happens, I guess I just hang up all my stuff, because then it's been basically channeled back in and it'll be pushed back out as a product, and it won't represent anything that we're doing at all. And that's the big worry that I have. Now, it's funny, like, there are these tariffs that are coming. Now, Walmart is a little bit nervous because they said that they have to eat the tariffs. So instead of doing a radical thing by making their products cheaper, you know, so that their customers can get a break, they're actually going to raise their prices. So it's this sort of like, here's a chance where a giant corporation has billions of dollars